The Science of Meditation. Chapter 17. The Evolution of Consciousness. In earlier chapters, I explained that the biological essence of meditation lies in allowing the body to enter a state of sleep while maintaining full consciousness. If that is true, a natural question arises: why, during meditation, especially in deep meditative states, can the body remain upright, rather than collapsing to one side as it often does when one falls asleep sitting up, such as on a train or an airplane? That is indeed an excellent and unavoidable question. To answer it, we must first clarify a few points. The first is that not all animals lose consciousness when they sleep. So, which animals completely lose consciousness during sleep, and which do not? That, in itself, is a complex question, partly because it is difficult to define what complete loss of consciousness truly means, and partly because the depth of sleep and level of awareness vary greatly across species. For most mammals, especially primates, during deep slow-wave sleep, also known as N3 sleep, activity in the cerebral cortex drops sharply. At this stage, it takes a strong external stimulus to awaken the animals, which appear to be nearly unconscious. Their brains process little external information, and their subjective experiences are greatly diminished. In contrast, animals that exhibit unihemispheric sleep, such as whales, dolphins, and certain bird species, never become completely unconscious, since one hemisphere of their brain remains awake to sustain vital functions such as breathing or to stay alert for predators. As a result, these animals retain a high degree of environmental awareness even while asleep. Reptiles, amphibians, and fish, although their cerebral cortex is underdeveloped or even absent, also exhibit two distinct states of movement, active and quiet. Research has shown that during their quiet, or sleep-like, states, they still maintain some responsiveness to external stimuli, which indicates that they are not completely unconscious. Similarly, insects and invertebrates, such as fruit flies, bees, and octopuses, seldom enter a state of total unresponsiveness. In short, human slow-wave sleep, N3, represents an almost complete suspension of consciousness. Most other animals, however, retain a minimal level of awareness that is essential for their survival, such as staying alert to potential predators. In other words, only humans and a few other mammals experience near-total unconsciousness during deep sleep, while the majority of animal species preserve at least a faint trace of consciousness or sensory perception, even in their most quiescent moments. For example, fish do not get swept away by currents while they sleep. Even in a resting state, their fins remain slightly extended or make subtle movements to stabilize their position. In other words, they never become completely relaxed. Instead, they enter a low metabolic resting state in which certain muscles maintain tone, and their sensory systems, especially their lateral lines, continue to detect water flow and potential threats, allowing them to adjust their posture or swim away when necessary. You might say, but fish are not humans. True. But we must not forget the theory of evolution. Life evolved from single-celled organisms to invertebrates, then to chordates, from chordates to fish, from fish to amphibians, reptiles, early mammals, and primates, and finally to humans. Although humanity did not evolve directly from modern fish, we did descend from ancient fish-like ancestors that gradually developed into four-limbed vertebrates. In that sense, humans and fish are distant relatives, branches of the same ancient tree of life. Another point worth clarifying is that bodily movement is not entirely governed by consciousness. Internal bodily activities, such as heartbeat, breathing, and digestion, are clearly beyond voluntary control. Even the movement of our limbs is not wholly directed by conscious intention. Here, consciousness refers to the activity arising from the conscious brain, namely the cerebral cortex, particularly the neocortex, which is responsible for higher cognitive functions such as thought, language, and decision-making. However, not all animals possess a cerebral cortex. In fact, the cerebral cortex is found only in vertebrates and is most developed in reptiles, birds, and mammals. Mammals possess the characteristic 6-layer neocortex, birds lack this layered structure, but have functionally complex equivalent regions. Reptiles have only a primitive 3-layer cortex. Fish have no cortex at all, possessing only simpler clusters of neurons. Amphibians exhibit some rudimentary cell layers, but not a true cortex. Invertebrates, meanwhile, have none. Thus, only reptiles, birds, and mammals can be said to possess a cerebral cortex, and even then, its complexity varies greatly. For animals without a cortex, and for our own precortical ancestors, the question arises, how were limb movements controlled? How did they maintain balance or respond to danger? The answer is straightforward. In animals without a cortex, such as fish, amphibians, and lower invertebrates, movement is governed by other neural structures. The brainstem, the most ancient part of the central nervous system, controls vital functions and basic movement patterns, including breathing, swallowing, swimming, and walking rhythms. The spinal cord, which contains central pattern generators, CPGs, produces rhythmic movements, such as swimming in fish or walking in cats, even without cortical input. Experiments have shown that these rhythmic actions persist even when the brain is removed. The cerebellum, evolutionarily older than the cortex, coordinates movement and maintains balance. In species with little or no cortex, like fish and birds, the cerebellum is typically well developed to sustain posture. Ganglia and reflexes control localized movement. In invertebrates such as worms and insects, each body segment may contain a ganglion that is capable of independently coordinating movement. Likewise, vertebrates have reflex arcs, such as withdrawing a hand from a flame, that are managed by the spinal cord without cortical involvement. In some, animals without a cortex rely on the brainstem, spinal cord, with its CPGs, cerebellum, and neural ganglia to control movement. The cortex evolved later, mainly to support complex learning, planning, and fine motor coordination. Basic movements do not depend on it. This raises a deeper question: if animals without a cortex, and thus without a conscious brain, can still perceive and act purposefully, does this suggest that the non-conscious brain, including the brainstem, cerebellum, and spinal cord, possesses a rudimentary form of consciousness, even if it is not the higher-level awareness that is typically produced by the conscious brain? This is a highly debated topic. Many animals that lack a cortex can still perceive light, sound, and odors, and respond flexibly to their environment. For instance, fish can avoid danger and learn navigational routes, while octopuses can solve puzzles and use tools. Such behaviors indicate a form of sensory awareness, a primitive consciousness. Only mammals, and particularly humans, through the neocortex, develop self-awareness, reflective thought, and the capacity for abstract reasoning. One widely accepted theory of consciousness holds that it depends on the degree of informational integration within a system, and is not necessarily confined to the cortex. Animals that lack a cortex may still possess basic subjective experiences. Octopuses, crows, and bees exhibit learning and decision-making that go beyond mere instinct, suggesting that consciousness can emerge without a cortical structure. For example, octopuses can open jars, play, and recognize individual humans, behaviors that many scientists interpret as evidence of subjective experience. Bees can even grasp abstract concepts such as same and different, indicating a form of elementary perceptual awareness. Furthermore, studies suggest that fish may experience pain, rather than merely exhibiting reflexive responses. With these facts in mind, we can now return to our original question: if meditation truly allows the body to enter a sleep-like state while the mind remains fully awake, why is it that people can remain upright during deep meditation, rather than collapsing to one side? The answer is actually quite simple. Meditation is indeed a process in which the body enters a sleep-like state while consciousness remains fully awake. The key, however, is that this allows us to relinquish conscious control of the body and hand it over entirely to the non-conscious brain. Once this transfer occurs, balance and posture are no longer managed by the conscious brain, but by the deeper, non-conscious systems. Thus, when we sit in meditation, especially during deep states, the body can remain upright because the non-conscious brain, having taken over control, retains primitive awareness and motor regulation. It maintains stability and balance, even as the conscious mind relinquishes control. At this point, you may gain a fresh perspective on the often mentioned terms subconscious, unconscious, and collective unconscious. By recognizing that consciousness has evolved over millions of years, from simple to complex, from lower to higher, from centralized to distributed, and that it exists not only in the cortex but also in the brainstem, cerebellum, and spinal cord, these once abstract psychological concepts begin to make much more sense and feel far clearer and more intuitive. Isn't it remarkable how what once seemed mysterious can now be understood in the light of evolution and the structure of the brain?